this is joint research in collaboration with Timo Göschel and Sina Klein from the Institute of Economics at Heidelberg. My colleague Simon Schaub from the Institute of Political Science, and also our colleagues from the KIT in Karlsruhe, Ulrike Scherer and Harald Horn. And this project was actually realized in the context of the Water Network Baden-Württemberg, which was a fantastic program, as we all thought, but which unfortunately was phased out. It continues to exist, but it does not facilitate joint research projects anymore. But this is an outcome of this funding frame. So sometimes attending a conference can actually change your life. And this is actually what happened to me. When I attended the Regulatory Governance Conference in the Netherlands in 2016, that was around the time when we were playing in the European Championships in soccer against Spain, maybe. So I do remember that day very well, because no one really paid attention to the conference. Everyone was very excited about the football match, which was upcoming for the evening. But there was also another detail which actually inspired this line of research to me. So as many of you who have ever attended a conference will know, you usually get conference bags, and they include items. And one of the items I was given at that conference in the Netherlands was actually a refillable bottle. And it said, yeah, refill your bottle, save the climate. And this was actually the very, very first time that I started to think about the ecological, but also climate-related impacts of bottled water. And I started to become curious about this and to take a look into this empirical phenomenon. And I'm not the only one who has started to pay attention to the various impacts of bottled or tap water. I mean, of course, you have to see both as one as one side of the other, so to say. So they're complementary here. And this is an information graph produced by the European Commission, because with the revision of the European Drinking Water Directive, the Commission actually was very eager to emphasize the various benefits of tap water. And it produced, among other material, this graph here, where you can see what the economic and environmental impacts of tap water are. So first of all, you see that when you go for bottled water, you need to use many resources to produce plastic, but you also produce a lot of waste, right? It's not just the resources you need to be able to produce the plastic bags, but plastic bottles, but it is also the waste that actually is generated on the basis of consuming bottled water. And then there's this issue that 1 liter of tap water is actually very, very cheap. As I will show to you later on, in Germany, the price is 0.2 cents, which is so much lower than the price for the cheapest bottled water I could find in Germany. So tap water is extremely affordable. And against this background, it's actually the case that by shifting our consumption from bottled water to tap water, households can actually save money. So there is a sum calculated here from the European Commission. But what is even more important, perhaps, is that we can cut plastic waste and also reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because it's not just the production of the bottles and the waste that is generated by the bottles, but it is also the transport of the bottles which causes greenhouse gas emissions. And you have the trucks which are on the roads and create competition also for other vehicles, which kind of can result in congestions and many negative effects also for our health because of elevated traffic and mobility. So there are good reasons to actually drink tap water, especially in the European Union and especially in Germany, which I'm going to explain to you in a bit. But let's first take a look at the bottled water market in the European Union. So this is an overview produced by consultancy, Mordor Intelligence. I guess they're into Lord of the Rings, given the name. And what they did is they looked at what the market shares are of bottled water in the European Union. And what you see here is that Germany certainly sticks out as the biggest or the single largest market for bottled water, followed by countries such as Italy and also Spain and the United Kingdom. France too. France is actually the home of many like bottled water producers. But you can see that the market share in Germany is even much larger than the market share of the rest of Europe, which is really considerable here. So this is a very, very substantial chunk of the European market that pertains to Germany. So this is an overview which we produced for an overview paper published in Wires Water in 2020. And here we looked at the correlation between bottled water consumption and tap water consumption. And in some countries, the quality of tap water is so poor that it is hardly used for any kind of consumption. So this is, for example, the case in the East European countries. So you see here Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and naturally there the share of bottled water consumption is quite high. And then you see that we have places such as the Netherlands, the Nordic countries, where the quality of water is really, really good, so that the tap water consumption is very high. And as we would expect, the share of bottled water consumption is low. And when we look at this plot here, we see that, well, in fact, two countries stand out here. The one which lies at the heart of this presentation is Germany. So in Germany, we have a quite okay level of tap water consumption, which is usually for washing, cooking, etc. But we have, relative to the share of tap water consumption, an unusually high level of bottled water consumption. And Italy stands out even more, but the German case is even more puzzling because we have a very high quality of drinking water in Germany, throughout Germany, which in the case of Italy is actually not the case. In Italy, we have regional variation. So in particular in the south, the drinking water quality is not as good as it is in Germany. And from that perspective, Germany is really the odd one out when we look at this relationship as it is modeled here. So, so this is like what my case is about. It's about Germany, which has high, or actually a very high quality of drinking water. It is even said to have the world's highest standard for drinking water. And the costs for drinking water supplied through tap in Germany costs on average 0.2 cents. And the cheapest bottled water I could find, I have to say I searched this on the internet, so maybe in retail the prices could have been lower or not, was 17 cents. So you can see that the difference in prices is quite substantial here. And maybe a spoiler. So what I'm going to present you in shortly is actually findings from a survey which we fielded. And there we asked, among many other things, whether the respondents know how much tap water actually costs. And there were very, very few people who actually knew that tap water costs less than 1 cent. So that was a quite striking finding in our views, at least, that people have a sense that tap water is cheaper than bottled water, but they seem to be less aware of how much cheaper tap water actually is in comparison to bottled water. And regardless of all these facts, Germany is the biggest market for bottled water, and it is also projected to grow in the future between 1% and 2%, depending on which sources you follow. So why is this the case? That's the overarching research question of this project. And of course, I'm not going to look into this very, very broad research question in detail, but I will focus on a few variables which are the workhorses in political science, which is ideology, and which corresponds to the notion of prices in economics, for example, but more on this later on. So to understand how Germans consume water, we designed a survey study, and in doing so, we of course drew from existing survey studies, and we focused on the following aspects: the perception of the quality and security of water, taste preferences, knowledge about water, and I just presented you one variable or one item that actually aimed to capture how knowledgeable people are of tap water in particular. We attempted to capture as much as possible lifestyle choices. So also differentiating, for example, between drinking water habits at home and also when people are outside of their homes traveling, for example, or when they visit a restaurant. So these are also important aspects that need to be taken into consideration. Then, and as I just already alluded to, political attitudes, that's what political scientists do. They always start with political variables and then they take it from there. And we also chose a number of items which gauge environmental concerns, also including climate change concerns. And what we also did is we investigated in an experiment, in a survey experiment, whether advertising tap water could, in theory, increase its consumption. I will turn to this at the very end of the presentation. So we programmed the survey ourselves. This was mostly done by Sina Klein together with Simon Schaub. We used a tool called SOSI Survey. Here you can see what the commands look like, but we relied on a polling company called Respondi to recruit our respondents, since it's very difficult in Germany to draw samples from registries, so that you need to get a lot of like legal clearance from all sorts of authorities. This is nothing one wants to do if it can be avoided. And the nice thing about these online access panels is that they have grown substantially over time, which is actually also reflected in our data that in the beginning, when surveys were based on online access panels, they were usually screwed in terms of age. So there was an overrepresentation of particularly young people, particularly well-educated people. But since now more and more people are recruiting themselves into these online access panels, we can actually see that the distribution of certain descriptive characteristics approaches that of the general population. So that is very nice. So it's, but it's important to mention this, that it's not a registry-based sampling, but it is a sampling for which we use an online access panel offered by a commercial provider. This is what our sample looked like. So we decided to go for 2 waves. At the first wave, we had a participation number of more than 5,800. And for the second wave, we had 4,600. So there was a bit of an attrition here, which is normal. You usually have that. People drop out for all sorts of reasons. And in terms of the gender distribution, just to see how much we approach the general population in Germany, we had a fairly good gender balance, so 51% male and 49% female. The mean age was 43 years, which is actually much higher than we expected it to be. So that's good. That kind of approaches the mean in the population. And we also managed to survey people being aged 18 to 65 years. Also, in terms of the distribution of the educational outcome variables, you can see that we had actually a good distribution. And what was important for our purpose, it was to have a representative sampling across the federal states, because what the water chemists based at the KIT do is they are currently adding water quality data to our survey data so that we can see whether the perceived quality of water actually corresponds to the objective water quality. And these are things water chemists can do. I couldn't do this, or I could not make sense of it. But for that purpose, it was important that we have this representative distribution of the federal states, because there are some differences across the states in how tap water is produced, also how water supply structures function. For our purpose, it was also important that we have a fair distribution between people living in rural areas and also urban areas, just to see whether there may be any differences depending on where people live. So for the talk today, we followed the literature on sustainable consumerism or sustainable consumption. These studies are rooted at the intersection between sociology and business and consumer studies. And yet they're important, or actually not important, but maybe appealing to political scientists, because this literature usually includes one political variable, which is the self-placement of individuals on a left-right scale. So the individuals are asked whether they would consider themselves to be left-leaning or right-leaning, and you usually have a scale which ranges from 0 to 10, or actually 1 to 10. And that's a standard operationalization of political attitudes. And of course, there are all sorts of expectations that come with this self placement on a left-right scale. But what we wanted to do here was not to limit ourselves to this variable which pops up regularly in these studies, but to differentiate between the self-placement on an ideological scale, but to combine that information with party support, like asking the respondents which party they support. Because there's a discussion, mostly in the political science literature, that these ideology scales actually capture something else than support for political parties. And here, as I will also show later on, it is actually meaningful to ask for party support rather than to go for a rather basic left-right scale. So that's the point of departure here. And of course, we are perfectly aware that water drinking habits are certainly not caused by ideology or anything, right? So there's a correlation with ideological traits, but if we are more into understanding how these water drinking habits are caused, it's absolutely important to understand that early infancy is key. So so we can actually withdraw from a literature that makes a compelling case that consumption behavior is an outcome of intergenerational transmission. So we tend to do what we have seen at home with our parents and families. And what is interesting to mention, and that's another spoiler at this point, is that actually most respondents indicated that parents and family are their most important source of information regarding drinking water, right? So so that seems to be the context in which they form their attitudes and also decide how to go about drinking water. So given that, given the fact that it is really the early infancy that determines our taste for water, or our preference for water, and also considerations regarding social status, social mobility, for example, we're fully aware that we cannot perform causal analysis here. I mean, that's a limitation we are perfectly aware of, but we can still uncover some interesting correlations here. And as I mentioned a couple of times already, the role of ideology appears to be quite interesting, especially from the perspective, as I tried to sketch out earlier, that most studies do not really look into like party support, which we think we can contribute to that literature. We formulated 3 hypotheses. So we expect that left-leaning individuals have a higher likelihood for drinking tap water at home than right-leaning individuals, but that we expect to be driven by a compound effect related to being more post-material. As a left-wing person, right, post-materialism implies that water as a status, like bottled water as a status symbol, would not be important. But people just go for things they consider to be morally desirable. But you can already see when I motivate the hypothesis that this is actually not such a clear mechanism here, right? But that's what the literature usually argues. So left-leaning individuals should have a higher likelihood of drinking tap water. What makes more sense is to argue, and especially in the German context, that individuals who support the Green Party have a higher likelihood of mostly drinking tap water at home, simply because here we can assume that the individuals who indicate that they support the Green Party have a higher likelihood for having a pro-environment or pro-climate orientation. So these should be the people who care about the potentially negative effects of bottled water. And then we have a complementary hypothesis where we postulate that supporters of the left, so the party the left, also have a higher likelihood of mostly drinking tap water at home because of their anti-capitalistic orientation, right? So because they are anti-private industry and in full support of the state and state services, and that they therefore have a preference for drinking tap water at home. So let's take a look at some descriptives now. So most participants indicated that they mostly consume bottled water at home. We refer to bottled water as mineral water, which is what people would usually understand as bottled water. And this is followed by tap water. And then just a detail here, of course, one aspect which one would come up with immediately, especially in the German context, is to make the argument that it is not so much about water being tap water or bottled water, but that it is more about water being carbonated or not. But interestingly, there was not a striking majority indicating that they like or they prefer sparkling water, only 43%. And also the use of soda streams was relatively low, which we found quite interesting. So there is actually a preference even among those who consume tap water for still water, so non-sparkling water. But that's a taste-related factor which one also needs to take into consideration. And what we also found interesting was that only 23% of the respondents who drink tap water indicate that they use water filters. So the reservations with regard to any remaining pollutants or issues with regard to the security or safety of water do not seem to dominate that much in the German context. And I'm fully aware that this is something which we would certainly see with bright motivation in other countries, that people kind of treat the tap water before drinking it. But in the German context, it's effectively unnecessary, and this view seems to be shared by the majority of respondents. This is an overview of all the variables which we included in the analysis. So we have this ideology variable, and then which is the left-right scale ranging from 1 to 10. We have factorized variables, so all of these variables are binary, indicating whether people support the German parties as they're written out on the slide. We have a variable where we ask the respondents about whether they believe in climate change. We control for the gender of the respondents, their age, education level, the number of children in their households, and also for the income. And what was very striking to us was that actually the number of missings was relatively low for party support. So the share of missings is around 7 to 8% here, and we actually feared that it would be much, much higher than that, because usually Germans do not like to talk about the parties they support, and they also don't like to talk about their income. And you see this, we also have missings of around 7 to 8% with regard to the income variable. So this is something Germans really don't like to talk about. This gives you a sense of the associations the respondents have with tap water and bottled water. So you can see here that bottled water is considered to be perceived superior to tap water with regard to being clean, having a higher quality, being more hygienic, also being a bit more healthy than tap water. And the taste seems to be an issue, actually a key issue here. Whereas tap water, and that's kind of reassuring, is considered to have positive environmental effects and considered to be climate friendly and also being fresh and natural. Actually, we were not so sure about whether tap water would be considered to be natural, because like if you think of commercials for bottled water, for example, this is where you usually see the wells and nature and so on. But it's interesting that these like nature related images also seem to be given for tap water. Then an overview of the ideological self-placement of the respondents. You see here that most of our respondents, and this is perfectly expectable, place themselves in the middle, so they hold a center position, so they're neither left nor right leaning. But we have quite a few who indicated that who indicate that they are slightly right leaning. So usually you don't expect that, especially not with online access surveys, where you mostly expect people to be a bit overrepresented on the left-hand side of the scale. So here we have actually this category which has a quite high density here, with people who indicated that to be slightly right-leaning, which is interesting when we look at the party support they indicated, because here you can see which parties our respondents mentioned to support. And perhaps I should have mentioned this earlier, we fielded the survey in August and September last year, so that was exactly the time when the campaigns for the federal elections took place in Germany, which could actually be one of the reasons why we obtained such high response for party support. And what you see here is actually, despite the fact that we had as the second highest category slightly right-leaning respondents, we actually see that support for the Green Party and the SPD is actually the biggest chunk here. So that actually the overall support for left-wing parties is certainly higher than for right-wing parties, which would be the CDU and the FDP and the AfD. And that's also actually interesting to see that quite a few people indicated, more than 10% indicated that they would support the AfD, which is a good sign in terms of the representativeness of the sample we drew together with Respondi, actually. So we have all kinds of ideologies represented here. But if we compare this to the vote shares at the federal elections, this is not very accurate. But it's still interesting to see that with the first indicator, people said they are slightly more right-wing, and here there's a clear pattern in favor of more left-wing parties. Yeah, so here this is a very descriptive analysis, which already shows you a bit how the responses are distributed for people depending on whether they indicated to be positioned on the left or on the right end of the ideology scale. So if we look at tap water consumption as a share, the differences are not that great. But when we ask them about whether tap water is the most often consumed beverage at home, we see that we have a bit of a negative trend. So the more people indicate that they are right-wing, the lower is actually the indicated share of respondents saying that they prefer tap water at all times. These are the findings of logit models which we fitted. If coefficients that cross the vertical line are insignificant, which means that there is an effect, but the effect could just be there by pure chance. And therefore, I will just limit my interpretation here to the coefficients that are significantly different from zero in terms of their effects. These are logit coefficients, so we cannot say anything about the size of the effects. For that, we need to compute predicted probabilities. But here we see whether or not the coefficients are significant and whether the effect is positive or negative in the sense that it increases the chances that a respondent indicated to mostly drink tap water at home. And here we see a clear effect of being a supporter of the Green Party. So this variable has a significant and positive impact on the likelihood of mostly drinking tap water at home, compared to supporters of the CDU, which is the reference group here, and also members of the other parties, but it's kind of hard to disentangle which parties are meant here, and therefore it's not so reasonable to interpret this effect. Individuals who believe in climate change have a higher likelihood, females have a higher likelihood, and also the education level has an impact on indicating to have a preference for tap water. Age is interesting. Actually, an increase in age reduces the likelihood of indicating that tap water is the most preferred drink. It's difficult to interpret that. It's just a control variable, but I wanted to flag it because the effect is quite straightforward here. But most importantly, we see that the classic left-right scale actually fails to reach conventional levels of significance, which is here a 95% confidence interval, which we used. I mean, considering the number of observations we have in this data set, that's perfectly fine. So I would not go anywhere below 95% here for a hypothesis test. So if we if this is like what we accept for our hypothesis test, we see that the coefficient for the left-right self-placement is actually insignificant or produces an insignificant coefficient. This is a figure which presents you the marginal, not the marginal effect, it's actually the predicted probabilities. How high the probabilities are for indicating that a person would drink mostly tap water at home given his or her support for a party. And we see that the likelihood is, I think, around 32% or so in the case of someone who indicated to support the Green Party, where it is lowest for supporters of the CDU with just 22%. So we do see differences, very clear differences in the likelihood, in the predicted probabilities of indicating that respondents would prefer tap water over bottled water here. Yes, so if we go back to our hypothesis, we can actually only confirm hypothesis 2A. We have to reject H1, but we also have to, reject H2. So we could not find any significant effect of the left. And this could be the case because when we look at the Green Party has actually really made the consumption of tap water an issue, and it is also very clear about the why people should drink tap water, right? So the party has actually mobilized this issue, or has mobilized support for this issue. And it would make a lot of sense that people who indicate to support the Green Party have also come across this kind of campaign. I mean, it was not the main topic, of course, but as you see here, the Green Party talked about it, right? The left also talked about water, also about tap water, but from a completely different perspective. There was actually this anti-capitalistic framing of tap water, but not so much with regard to the individual consumption patterns, but rather with regard to water supply. And the left is the party that has supported very much so, actually, an initiative which was launched back in 2012 at the European level, known or called Right to Water, where there was actually a significant societal mobilization to prevent water supply from being privatized in the European Union. And this is a very left party-ish theme, actually, not to focus so much on the behavior of individuals, but to focus more on the fact that water should be affordable, and to ensure that water is affordable, that it must not be privatized. And that could be actually the reason why the effects for the supporters of the left party were not so clear, because the consumption of tap water is lumped together with all sorts of other considerations that all boil down to a privatization critical position with regard to water supply. So I think now it's time to conclude. So I hope I could show you that there exists a tap water related puzzle in Germany. There is a high quality and accessibility, but a relatively low consumption of it. There are many, many factors which determine why Germans drink water the way they do. So whether it's bottled water or tap water. And as a political scientist, it's very natural for me to start with political variables. And the player I made here was to look at party support rather than looking at the left-right self-placement. And there we could see that it is mostly the parties, it's the party supporters of the Greens who have a higher likelihood of consuming tap water. So we can say that the effect of ideology is less robust than the effect of party support. Although, I mean, party support, of course, is also like driven by ideology, but the measurement of party support is just more precise than that of this very rough left-right self-placement. And actually, that would be a question I have to you guys, whether you would have a sense of what you're indicating when you're asked to place yourself on a left-right scale. And well, yeah, I think this is certainly just the start. There are so many more interesting questions to ask, and there's so much more in our data set, and more is coming soon on this topic. So we're currently working on this paper, but I think there are all sorts of interesting things that we can do with our data, in particular with water chemical components, which are supplied by our colleagues based at Karlsruhe. So in concluding, first of all, I would like to thank you for your attention, but I also wanted to come back to that, very quickly come back to that survey experiment which we ran. And what we did there was we showed half of our respondents this video, which we were authorized to use by Münchenwasser, which is actually a clip promoting tap water in Munich. And we were interested to see whether people who watched the clip indicated that they would that they would in the future consume more tap water. And then we returned to them and asked them at the second wave whether like they have changed their consumption pattern. But unfortunately, there was no treatment effect, right? So people indicated, sure, we're going to change our behavior. This is amazing. But once we asked them, so how did you really change your water consumption behavior? There was no significant difference between the control group and the treatment group. But I thought I could show this to you because there are attempts by tap water providers to actually mimic what the bottled water companies are doing, right, to produce advertisement here. And I thought this is kind of nice to see something like that at such a late hour of a day. And this is the very, very final slide. So I'm not only here in my capacity as a professor of political science, but I also happen to be the editor of a newly founded journal called Climate Action. And you may or may not have come across this journal, but I wanted to make sure that after this talk, you know that this journal exists and that it publishes exciting research. It's completely open access, and for like scholars who are affiliated with German universities, there is also no article processing charge, so you get an open access publication for free. And currently we're very efficient in handling manuscripts, so 3 to 4 weeks, and then you'll have a first decision on your submissions. And we have already free calls for special issues, and I just wanted to flag the one which I love just by the title, which is the one on the International Panel on Climate Change, whether it's a dinosaur or dynamo for climate action. And on that note, I'll stop and